The assumption. For 20 years before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy planned one battle. It had a name, Kantai Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, and the entire structure of the Japanese Navy was built around it. The ship designs, the gunnery training, the night fighting doctrine that made Japanese destroyer crews the best in the world at what they did, the long lance torpedo, all of it existed to serve one scenario. The scenario went like this. War comes. The United States, being far more powerful industrially, must eventually send its battle fleet west to relieve or retake the Philippines. That fleet has to cross the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from its bases, and as it comes, it is attrited. Submarines take a share. Land-based aircraft from the island chains take a share. Destroyer flotillas make night torpedo attacks and take a share. And then, somewhere in the Western Pacific, a weakened American fleet, exhausted from its passage, running low on fuel and ammunition, thousands of miles from any dockyard, meets the Japanese battle line in home waters, fresh and concentrated. Japan wins the war in an afternoon. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. That plan was not stupid. It was not the fantasy of men who did not understand modern war. It was a perfectly sound reading of how navies had operated for the entire age of steam, and it was very close to what the American war plans of the 1920s and 1930s also expected to happen, because every fleet in history had been chained to its bases. That was simply what a fleet was. By early 1945, an American task force was operating continuously off the coast of Japan, not raiding and withdrawing, operating for weeks, then months without going home. Refueled, rearmed, resupplied, with new aircraft and new pilots arriving to replace losses, and damaged ships repaired and returned to the line. The nearest American dockyard was thousands of miles away, and it did not matter. Japanese naval officers, then and after the war, kept circling the same question, and it was not about carriers or aircraft or radar. It was more basic than that. Where were they getting the fuel? Why a fleet is chained to a port. Start with the arithmetic because it explains why every professional in the world made the same assumption. The distance from Pearl Harbor to home waters is on the order of 3 and 122,000 nautical miles. From Pearl to the Marianas is comparable. These are not distances you cross casually. Now consider what a fast carrier task force actually consumes. The carriers themselves are relatively long-legged. The problem is the destroyers. A destroyer is a small hull with enormous engines, and at the speeds a carrier force operates. High speed for launch and recovery, high speed to reposition, high speed to run down a contact. A destroyer burns through its fuel in a couple of days, 3 at the outside. So the destroyers set the leash length, and the destroyers are not optional. They are the screen. They are the anti-submarine defense. They are the reason the carriers survive. Then add ammunition. A carrier air group flying strikes expends bombs, torpedoes, rockets, and enormous quantities of aviation fuel and machine gun ammunition. A battleship or cruiser doing shore bombardment empties its magazines in days. Then add aircraft, combat losses, operational losses, deck crashes. A carrier that has been fighting for 3 weeks is short of airplanes. Then add pilots, killed, wounded, exhausted. Then add food and fresh water and spare parts and everything a floating city of several thousand men needs. Under the traditional model, when any one of those runs out, the fleet goes home. And going home from the Western Pacific to Pearl Harbor means roughly 2 weeks steaming each way, plus time in port, a month minimum out of the war, which means that under the traditional model, the Japanese assumption is correct. The Americans could raid, and then they would have to leave, and the initiative would return. The Americans did something else instead. They stopped treating the base as a place. The technical foundation of all of it is unglamorous and looks in photographs like 2 ships steaming uncomfortably close together. Underway replenishment, refueling a warship at sea at speed, while both vessels maintain course and station. The U.S. Navy had been working on this since the First World War era and had been developing the broadside method through the 1920s and 1930s. A receiving ship steaming alongside a tanker at something around 10 to 12 knots, perhaps 100 ft apart, with fuel hoses rigged across the gap on tension lines. If that sounds routine, it is not. Two ships running parallel at close range are subject to hydrodynamic interaction. The water between them accelerates, pressure drops, and the hulls are pulled toward each other. Holding station requires constant skilled helm work. A moment's inattention is a collision. A parted hose under tension is a whipping steel reinforced line across a crowded deck. Men were killed doing this routinely, and the Americans got so good at it that by 1944, they were not only passing fuel, they were passing ammunition, heavy, awkward, explosive, from ammunition ships to carriers and cruisers at sea. They were passing provisions. They were flying replacement aircraft onto carriers from escort carriers stationed with the logistics groups. They were transferring replacement pilots and replacement crewmen by breeches buoy, swinging men across the gap between two moving ships on a line. The comparison that makes the point best is not with Japan. It is with Britain. When the British Pacific Fleet arrived in 1945, a first-rate navy with 3 centuries of experience and outstanding ships, it discovered that its own replenishment capability was not remotely adequate to sustain operations at the tempo the Americans were running, and it leaned heavily on American logistics to stay in the fight. British officers said so plainly afterwards. This was not a matter of courage or seamanship. It was a capability the Royal Navy had not built and could not conjure in a year. The Americans had spent 2 decades practicing a boring skill in peacetime, and it turned out to be the skill that decided the geography of the Pacific War. The men in this story are tanker crews, repair ship machinists, and stevedores on barges in a lagoon nobody has heard of. Refueling at sea extends the leash. It does not fix everything because you cannot repair a torpedo hit from a hose. So they built the rest of it, and they built it out of ships. In January 1944, the Navy formed Service Squadron 10 under a Commodore named Worrell Reed Carter, universally called Nick Carter. And what he was given was not a squadron in any normal sense. It was a naval base disassembled into floating parts, repair ships with machine shops and foundries aboard, destroyer tenders and submarine tenders, ammunition ships, provision ships with refrigerated holds, oilers, hospital ships, tugs, barges, salvage vessels, floating dry docks, and the whole thing moved. As the fleet advanced, Service Squadron 10 picked up and went with it. Majuro first, then Eniwetok, then from October 1944, an atoll in the Western Carolines called Ulithi. Ulithi had been taken in late September 1944, essentially without a fight because the Japanese had left. What the Americans found was a lagoon roughly 20 miles long and 10 across. Sheltered water big enough to hold an entire fleet about $1,300 mi from Tokyo. At its peak in early 1945, more than 600 ships were anchored there at one time. Understand what that means. By tonnage at anchor, Ulithi was for a period one of the largest naval bases on Earth. It had no permanent structures worth the name. It did not appear in newspapers. The overwhelming majority of Americans had never heard of it, and most of them still have not. And inside that lagoon was everything a dockyard does. There were floating dry docks, sectional structures towed across the Pacific in pieces and bolted together on site in sizes running up to docks capable of lifting a battleship out of the water. A ship holed by a torpedo off Formosa did not go to Hawaii, and it did not go to California. It went to a coral lagoon, was lifted out of the sea by an assembly of steel boxes that had been towed there, was patched, and went back to the war. The clearest single demonstration came in October 1944. During the strikes on Formosa, the cruisers Canberra and Houston were both hit by aerial torpedoes and disabled. In an ordinary war, they were losses. You scuttle them, or you lose the ships that try to save them. They were taken under tow and dragged across roughly 500 MEI of open ocean under air attack back to Ulithi. Halsey, who had a sense of humor about it, used the 2 crippled ships as bait to try to draw Japanese forces into a trap, and the informal designation the sailors gave that group tells you everything about the American attitude to the situation. They called it Bait Division 1. Both ships survived, and the lagoon had other things. There was an island in the atoll called Mog Mog, set aside for recreation, where crews came ashore in rotation for a few hours of beach and a ration of warm beer. There were barges fitted out as chapels and as cinemas. There was, on at least one vessel, an ice cream plant, two concessions, and the first is severe. On the 18th of December 1944, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was operating east of the Philippines, and its destroyers were low on fuel. Refueling was attempted, and the sea was too rough. A destroyer that is low on fuel rides high. Its tanks empty, its ballast wrong, its stability badly reduced. They were in the path of a typhoon that had not been properly located, and the fleet maneuvered into the worst of it. Three destroyers, the Hull, the Monaghan, and the Spence, capsized and sank. Around 790 men died. Nearly 150 aircraft were lost or destroyed. Ships across the fleet were badly damaged. A court of inquiry was held, and it was critical of the command decisions. That is the human cost of the fuel problem, and it is a direct one. The very fact that the destroyers had to be refueled constantly at sea in whatever weather there was is what put those ships in that position on that day. The system that made the fleet unstoppable also created the circumstance that drowned 790 men in a storm. Second concession, smaller but worth saying, the lagoon was not safe. On the 20th of November 1944, the oiler Mississiniwa was destroyed at anchor in Ulithi by a Japanese man's suicide torpedo. 63 men died, and the atoll's own inhabitants were relocated to accommodate the fleet. Now look at what the Japanese Navy was doing at the same time, because the contrast is the whole argument. By late 1944, Japan's fuel situation had become structurally impossible. The oil was in the south, Borneo, Sumatra, and the tankers bringing it north were being sunk by American submarines faster than they could be replaced. The consequence at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 is one of the most revealing facts of the Pacific War. The Japanese fleet could not concentrate because it could not be fueled in one place. Korea's battleship force sorted from Brunei in the south because that was where the oil was. Ozawa's carrier force came down from Japan because that was where the aircraft and the few remaining pilots were. The great decisive battle that Japanese doctrine had planned for 20 years was fought by a navy that had been physically split in half by its own logistics, and the two halves could not be brought together. And it is reported that some of Korea's ships were burning barely refined Borneo crude, taken more or less straight from the wellhead, because there was no capacity to process it properly. A volatile fuel that made a hit far more likely to start a serious fire. Verdict, here is the verdict. Every navy in the history of steam had defined a fleet's reach by one number, the distance to its nearest base. That is not a doctrine, it is a fact of physics, and Japanese strategy was built on it in exactly the way a bridge is built on the ground. The United States Navy did not find a way around that number. It did something stranger. It stopped treating the base as a place at all. Ulithi was not a port. It was a formation. It was 600 ships that had agreed to sit in the same lagoon and behave like a dockyard. And when the fleet moved forward, the dockyard weighed anchor and followed, which changes the question completely. The old question was, how far can we operate from our base? The new question was, how quickly can our base catch up? And once you have asked the second question, distance stops being a geographic constraint and becomes a purchasable commodity. You want another 1,000 miles of reach? Build more oilers. You want to keep a damaged cruiser in the war? Tow a dry dock across the Pacific in sections. Distance costs hulls and hoses and men, and the United States had decided it would pay. Japanese strategy had no answer to that because Japanese strategy did not have a category for it. Kantai Kessen was not merely defeated. Its premise evaporated. There was never going to be a tired American fleet arriving at the end of a long voyage because the voyage never ended, and the fleet was never at the end of anything. The Japanese Navy spent 20 years preparing to fight a fleet that would arrive exhausted. The fleet that arrived had been at sea for 3 months, was fully fueled, had received replacement aircraft and replacement pilots at sea, and its crews had been ashore for an afternoon on a coral island with a beer ration. Nick Carter wrote the history of it after the war. He called the book Beans, Bullets, and Black Oil, which is about as accurate a title as anyone has ever put on a piece of military history, and it is not a book most people have read. And Ulithi itself, the anchorage that held 600 warships, the largest concentration of naval power in the world at that moment. The place from which the assault on Iwo Jima in Okinawa was launched went back to being an atoll. There was nothing permanent to leave. That was the entire point of it. The base was made of ships, and when the war ended, the ships sailed away. And what remained was a lagoon in the Western Carolines with a few thousand people living on it who had never asked for any of it. You can go there today. There is no monument. There is nothing to see. The greatest naval base of the war left no ruins because it was never built out of anything that stays. And remember what the Japanese admirals were really asking when they asked where the fuel was coming from. They were asking where the base was. There wasn't one. It was following the fleet. If this story changed how you view the logistical giants that won the Pacific War, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history they tried to bury. Let's plant the seeds of the future. The next treasure chest of history will open soon.